right. Good morning, everyone. I'm waiting for my video to load. All right, here we go. Good morning and welcome to the February Q&A session. So I'm excited to be here and I've got some great questions for today. So I'm just going to dive right in and I'll just give you kind of a synopsis of the questions that have come in. I'm going to get my screen up over here so that I can see if anybody's watching and posting questions as we go here. There we go. Let me see. There I am. Okay, we're ready to go. So I've got three different people who've asked questions that I'm going to kind of use to structure this today. And so the general topic flow is that I am going to address some questions about semantic feature analysis and problem solving when you have students who are, especially in the younger ages, how we should think about where they should be developmentally. So I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to address some questions about written versus oral language, especially use of syntax, especially when you get to the age where students really should be applying those skills. And when we're thinking about oral language versus written language and adverse effect and when the SLP should be involved and all of those things. So I'm going to get to some of those questions and then specifically some written language, higher level skills that where you're really asking students to apply some of those skills that you've been working on at the foundational level. And then I've got some questions about social language. So we'll get into all of those today. So I wanted to start off by just mentioning something, and I dove into this yesterday for those of you who are also in my SLP Learning Academy program that's focused more on collaboration and advocacy in our field. I addressed the issue of developmental norms and eligibility in the school systems. And the reason being because I know that that can be very confusing, and a lot of times you do need some documentation to go and explain why you're doing what you're doing. And so some of that mindset and that line of thinking that comes up when you think about articulation norms can be applied when you're thinking about language and written language as well, but it's very different as far as your decision-making process because of the whole concept of adverse effect. So before we get into the discussion on language, I wanted to just share a couple resources really quickly. I'm actually going to put them in the comments below the video after I sign off. But recently I came across, and they've been out for a while, but there was a study that was published. It was kind of a big synopsis of articulation developmental norms. And it basically said by age 5, 90% of kids should have most of their sounds. And everybody kind of freaked out because they thought, oh, does that mean that we should be qualifying students who can't say the R in kindergarten? And there was this, big to do. Everybody was kind of confused about what it meant. And so I am going to share two things with you about that, even though that's about articulation and not language. And the reason I'm sharing with that is that we want to make sure that we really understand what developmental norms mean as far as what we're expecting kids to be able to do at a certain age, and using that information as far as determining what we should be working on with them. And then we also want to think about that as far as eligibility goes in the school systems. So that's why I'm sharing this, because we always want to think about that process and that information, and we always want to be interpreting the developmental norms accurately. And I see a lot of confusion about that with the way that questions are asked in different professional forums, with some of the, I would say, objections that I've gotten to some of the things that I recommend, and then also just other debates and discussions in the field. So with articulation, the things that I'm going to share, I'm going to share an article from the Informed SLP that is a summary that has a bunch of different links to different studies about developmental norms interpreting what they actually mean. And then there's another study or another article that takes that information from those articles and says, okay, this is what the norms are, but this is what they actually mean in practice when it comes to school eligibility. And so the quick and dirty explanation is that just because 90% of kids can say a certain sound or do a certain skill at a certain age does not necessarily mean that there's something wrong with a child if they are in that 10% that doesn't have the skill yet. And the way that we want to interpret that as far as what should we work on and what's the, are they eligible for services with articulation, the reason that a lot of times we would not necessarily be, if you're in the school systems, you wouldn't necessarily be providing direct services for a student. For example, if, again, 90% of kindergartners can say there are, then there's 10% that can't. We wouldn't necessarily assume that we should be providing intervention for those kids who don't have the R yet, just because they're not in the majority. And the reason being is because of the adverse effect. So in order to be able to make the determination that that child needs a special education service, you need to show that there's an adverse effect. And you can't always do that with articulation. Now, it gets a little bit fuzzy when you think about phonological disorders, especially in those early years. If you have a child that has multiple sound errors and you can clearly see that there are some language-based things going on, they're not catching on when it comes to language and literacy, you have a little bit more of a case for adverse impact. But when you have a student who's doing fine socially, academically, and they just have a mild sound error that maybe most of the kids their age have, that's when the adverse effect gets a little bit harder to justify, and you could actually be violating a student's rights by pulling them out. So I'm going to share those two articles just so that you have them. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how that same mindset applies to language. And I'm going to segue to the conversation about semantic feature analysis. And so I'm going to just read the question that was presented. Leanne asked this question. And she asked about a specific case. So I wanted to get some clarification before I give an answer. And because I didn't have a chance to go back and forth with Leanne, who asked this question, I'm going to do kind of a if this, then that sort of thing. Because I want to make sure that I give information in context and not make assumptions about what's going on. So first I'm going to talk about just generally what you can expect when it comes to things like categorization and definition, syntax, and semantic feature analysis. So when you're doing semantic feature analysis, it's about building awareness, building knowledge, giving kids strategies, and facilitating that growth, pulling more out of them, because a lot of times these kids have a hard time retrieving information and they don't have a lot of self-talk or dialogue to cue themselves to pull information out. So when you give them a way to self-question and start that internal dialogue, which we do with that strategy, that can be something that improves the amount of information, the quality and the quantity of information they're able to give when they are describing a word. The strategy is about improving that. And yes, we try to make it as objective as possible because you do have to write goals and collect data, and we have to objectify this somehow. But it gets a little bit fuzzy. We're trying to make something objective that is, again, a little bit fuzzy and hard to measure. So, because you can't always, you can look at what somebody is doing from a behavioral standpoint. You can't always measure exactly what's going on in their head. Sometimes what's going on in their head doesn't always translate to direct behaviors. We try as much as we can, but we know that it's not perfect. So with that all being said, I'm starting to lose my train of thought here. So with that all being said, we the point of semantic feature analysis isn't necessarily to get them to name every single feature of the word. It's to build that strategy and pull more information out of them. So it's not to get a perfect right answer. It's not to get them through a specific word list. Yes, we can look at the quality and the quantity of the words that they're able to do that strategy. We can look at the amount of information and the types of information they're able to give us. That does help us to quantify it somewhat, but we want to be careful about getting making sure that we're not too tied to like rigid guidelines with this. And I know that that is a little bit uncomfortable because you do get pressure from people who are like, you've got to get them to meet the goals, or we've got to have data and things like that. So I know that it is a subtle balance. So we want to just make sure that we go into these type of strategies with that in mind. And I know, because I felt the same way, I know that they like, you know, when you're in grad school or even when you go to seminars today, it's like data and developmental milestones, and you know, it's drilled into our heads like diagnostic criteria and cutoff points. So it is kind of hard to get out of that mindset, but we want to use that information without being too rigid about it. So with the reason I mentioned the articulation norms before is because you want to think about that. You want to remember that when you are thinking about language as well. And remember that with language, like with articulation, we do have some normative data that's clear. We want to make sure we interpret it the right way. Like it again, meaning just because 90% of kids have this sound by a certain age doesn't mean that everybody who doesn't have that sound needs therapy. So again, that's where the interpretation can get a little fuzzy with articulation. But with language, we don't even always have the at 90%, you know, 90% of kids have this skill by this age kind of thing. And there are so many other language skills that it can be so hard to measure that. And it, even if we tried to define that, people have already tried, and it's so variable that it's like it almost gets counterproductive if you try to define it too specifically. But with things like categorization and what I'm referencing here, if you don't have this book yet, it is a textbook. I know that a lot of people, once they're out in the field, you want super practical things that are already like made for you and everything. But textbooks aren't exactly that practical. But this is kind of the exception to the rule. This is Later Language Development by Marilyn Nippold, and this is a lot of the things that I teach you all in this program are heavily influenced by her work. It's not that crazy of a, you know, textbook. It's a fantastic resource. It's not, the reason that I really started diving into this is because people were asking me so many questions about developmental milestones. And I wanted to give everybody this nice little pretty chart of school age developmental milestones. When I started reading this and trying to define it and revisiting some of this, I was like, oh, well, that's why. Because it does get really hard to create a nice little neat chart. But if you read this book, it does give you the best information that is available. So you're not going to exactly get what you're looking for if you want these clear criterion at different ages, but you're going to get the next best thing and the closest thing that we have available. So when it comes to figuring out where kids should be when it comes to skills like categorization, usually around second grade is when we see kids start to be able to use clear defining features in their definitions. So for nouns, categorization is that thing, because if you don't have categorical information in your definition for a noun, it's not technically a complete definition, because all the other information is descriptive, but it doesn't actually say what the thing is. In order to actually define what the thing is, you have to put it in a category, and then you add the other information. So if I were to define this pencil right here, I would have to say it's a kind of tool, or it's a kind of writing utensil. If I wanted to be even more specific, that information has to be there in order for it to be a complete definition. And then I could, say it's a writing utensil that has lead, and it's made of wood, and it can have an eraser, and I can elaborate from there and give some additional descriptive features. But if I just said something like it has wood, and it can be yellow, that doesn't really explain what it is. But if I said it's a writing utensil that is made of wood and can be erased, you would know what I was talking about. So that complete information starts to come around second grade. But you want to interpret that as kind of like with the developmental norms, where it's, okay, most kids are starting to be able to do that around second grade. It doesn't mean that all kids are going to be able to do that by then, especially if kids haven't necessarily directly been taught those skills. With definition syntax, it appear to be a bit decontextualized, but again, and this is from Nippold and colleagues, that if you are, even though that skill is a bit more decontextualized, it is still, the exception to the rule, as far as kids need to learn how to do that in order to be successful in school. And also it does help them to really grasp those definitions of words and be able to do it, with other words when they're understanding that format of a definition. So that means that you could have kids who are in third or fourth grade, especially if they're on your caseload and they clearly need some more direct instruction and they haven't caught on to some of those skills. They could be in those later grades and still not have categorization. Now, then the question becomes, so what do you do with kindergartners? You obviously, even for the majority of kids, wouldn't expect them to have the ability to give that descriptive information. So they might be able to say those other things, but they're not able to give the category. So it doesn't mean that you don't work on category with them. It just means that you have to really scaffold and provide a lot of assistance there. So maybe when you're working through something like this, you're modeling the category, and then you're having them repeat it after you, and then they're going to elaborate on their own with the other features. Maybe you're giving them some kind of a sentence starter. Maybe you are showing them a picture that represents that category, and then they're coming up with the word. You want to think about all the ways that you can scaffold and get them to say the information and say the category, even though they're not doing it independently. And so think about how you can provide, when you have these skills that you want to build and facilitate. When you say this is normal for this age, it's not that we don't ever ask kids to go beyond that, because a lot of times pushing kids beyond where they are, that's how they learn those skills. It's, again, people talk to babies. It doesn't mean that we expect them to respond, but the way that we're interacting with them is because we are facilitating that language. That's how they're going to learn to eventually respond. That's how we want to think about it with language. So you should still work on it. It's just that when you're expecting them to do a skill independently, you might not expect them to do some of those harder features like categorization or naming a synonym for a verb or an adjective. You might not expect that direct information that is a clear defining feature yet. They probably need a lot of scaffolding and modeling. So that's how I would handle that when it comes to language and semantic feature analysis. So when it comes to figuring out how to address this with your students, I would just, again, you want to facilitate and scaffold, because if your students if you know that they're behind, chances are they're going to need a little bit more facilitation than their peers. So that's why we're getting ahead of it and doing it even earlier than we might expect. That's why we're going to give that additional modeling for these students, because we know preemptively, we know if they're on our caseload, they're at risk for not catching on to this on their own. So I would think about semantic feature analysis and all of these skills that we're working on. I would think about it that way, to where it, again, a lot of kids might be able to do a skill by a certain age, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of kids are going to be able to do it by a certain age. And we want to be careful about interpreting what 90% of kids having this at a certain age. It doesn't mean it's a clear criterion cutoff. But for language, it kind of, like the way that you would think about it, if there's an adverse effect on the student's learning for language, it's almost, I'm kind of telling you to do the opposite thing that you would do for articulation. Whereas if you've got a student who clearly doesn't have, again, mild sound error, doesn't have anything that's, impacting them, they're doing okay academically, again, it would be fine to send home, to do some kind of intervention that's not a special ed intervention, like sending home some information to the parents or something like that. But for language, if they are already on your caseload and they're qualifying for services, it's kind of the other way around, where you do want to start facilitating those skills and get ahead of it. But that's if you have identified that language is an issue and it's adversely impacting them. So I wanted to answer the question about this specific case. So I'm going to read specifically. Okay, so this particular student who was referred for word finding behaviors in the classroom, you've seen them as well, performed above average on every test given to him. Test of word finding, CASEL, TAPS, all average to above average. Stuttering test was average. Language processing was average. The only score that was low was on the C-top given by special ed teacher on the object naming test. Has been receiving outside services, so maybe he's progressed because he's gotten some outside intervention, but he might not qualify in school. The speech pathologist might be able to take him for additional RTI or give the teacher strategies to use. The SLP has already done some RTI with him for language, I think. And so the question is, what should we do with a student like this? They were referred for word finding issues, but really he's not showing any indication based on the formal assessment that word finding is an issue. The only thing that's coming out on the informal assessment is the issues on the C-top. So it does sound, I guess I would want some clarity as far as how the word finding abilities are impacting him in the classroom and on academic tasks. Based on what you're saying, it would be pretty hard to qualify this student in the school systems. So I would probably, if this student is, number one, there's not any formal data to support the word finding issues, and the only data that you have is the information on the C-top, I would want to know what else is impacted, like what other academic data you have to support the student, and the student is in kindergarten. So there's a couple ways that you could look at this. I would focus on the specific academic things that are impacting him right now. With word finding in the classroom, it's kind of hard because if this student needs some time to process, and maybe he could be experiencing some other things that are impacting word finding. I know that when I am on the spot, a lot of times I get kind of a brain freeze type of thing. not a brain freeze like when you eat ice cream, but I freeze up a little bit and I don't process very well. And I don't have a language disorder, but in that moment, my ability to use language is impacted. It could be that this student is impacted by other things in the situation. Um, and so that could be a possibility, that it could be something else that's causing those word finding issues aside from just language processing. But I would be interested to know if there are some issues with literacy and phonological awareness that are impacting his ability to perform on some of the specific academic tasks. So in kindergarten, if he's not, like, if you don't have any clear data to show that there's these vocabulary and word finding issues, it might be kind of hard to make the justification now. So I would focus more on the stuff that you do know is impacting. So there could be something that could be done to address literacy if he is coming out low on measures of reading. I'd be curious to know how he's doing with measures of early numeracy, if he's making progress there. And if he's not, then you might want to look into that specifically, if there are any interventions that are going to address some of those numeracy concepts as well. And that might look more like a math specific intervention, but whoever's doing that, it could be beneficial for you as the speech pathologist to have a conversation with them to see if any vocabulary issues are coming up. But again, you as the SLP might not yet in that particular situation be the person administering the intervention. So this, and again, I'm saying this based on not necessarily knowing for sure the answers to all of those questions. This is probably a situation where you would be involved on more of a potentially short-term basis, or more of a consultation basis. But if this student is scoring in the average range now, I wouldn't take him off your radar. I don't know that you could justify qualifying him for services and doing any specific intervention right now, that's pulled out, because it doesn't look like he's qualifying for special ed yet. But this would be a case where you'd probably want to monitor this student first grade, second grade, because a lot of times those tests that you're giving him, a lot of times they just don't pick up on those deficits because, some of them, if they're normed for like 5 and up, there's not a lot of leeway and sensitivity for those younger kids. So some of those things could come up later down the line. So that's why it is important for you to keep having conversations and checking in on this student and making sure that he is getting interventions that are tied to the direct academic things that are going on. Again, the phonological awareness, the vocabulary during specific academic tasks. That might be the best place to intervene right now. And if he is getting outside therapy from a speech pathologist, you could be communicating with that person as well, and seeing how this student is doing with some of the vocabulary tasks that they're doing there. You might share some information of some things that you're doing there, but it might be more of a consultation basis, because again, like, we want to get ahead of it, but also we don't want to pull a student out of class, because there is a chance that he could continue to make progress in class if the teacher is aware of some of these things that you might have been working on. So I would be definitely communicating with the teacher about this, being aware of when he does and doesn't have the word finding issues, to see, is it tied to language, is it tied to something else, and continue to monitor this student. So I hope that is helpful. Again, it's with the developmental norms, it's kind of hard beyond the beyond the information about categorization. That's when we start to see those skills develop. So if he doesn't have them yet, he might it doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, but if there is something that's impacting his performance in the classroom, we definitely want to keep an eye on that. So I don't think, again, I don't think this is a student that you say, okay, he didn't qualify, he's good. I would keep an eye on it. But I don't know that you could justify direct special ed services at this point. Consultation for sure. To be honest, all of the stuff that I'm teaching you in this program, it would be beneficial for probably most of the students in kindergarten to get. So, but I know that your bandwidth is only so much. So, but as much as you can educate teachers about this, the better, because then that's going to help you get ahead of it for these students where it's like they're not qualifying yet, but there's something going on here. So there is a chance that the student might qualify later on. But if you can get ahead of it with some specific literacy interventions, with some things that the teacher can do in the classroom, with some math interventions, if that's an issue as well, we want to do as much of that stuff as possible. And, maybe he will start to catch on to some of those things on his own and never need special ed services. That's the whole point of RTI. So, and I think it is appropriate when you think about how you might be involved in RTI as an SLP. You could, that could look a number of different ways, whether it be just like pulling a small group of students here or there to just kind of check on like this particular student, even if he's not on your caseload, just kind of checking in, or going into the classroom and doing some of these activities and training the teacher on them as well. So yeah, that is, it's not really a straightforward answer. It was a way longer explanation than I intended, but I hope that helps you think about some of these decisions that we have to make. What I want to do now is switch gears, and I'm going to go to, Jessica had 3 questions and Rachel had a question, and Rachel and Jessica's kind of had a question that went together. The question from Jessica was, what do you do for high school students who speak using correct grammar but continue to make errors in written expression? And then that is pretty similar to what Rachel was asking. Upper elementary students, again, so different grade level, but similar question. Upper elementary students continue to qualify for language based on the TILs, conversationally, correct grammatical structures, but they are not necessarily able to do it discourse level with some of the higher level strategies. So whether it be comprehension or whether it be using some of these skills in writing. So again, we're thinking both upper elementary through high school. What do we do for students that seem to be okay in conversation but don't necessarily translate this to written expression? Where is our role here? So as a general rule, we do want to remember that oral expression is often, so conversational language is easier than written language. It's less formal, it's less sophisticated. So there's that. But then also when you are writing or reading for that matter, but we'll talk about writing for this conversation, you are having to apply more skills at once. You have to think about morphology and orthography as well. And you have to think about the written symbols. So you're applying more skills at once. So writing is harder. So, and Jessica asked another question about this as well. Should we work on oral or written or just both, or should we work on them together? Really, we should be working on both. Where it gets a little bit confusing as far as the SLP's role is where we have to think about what are you qualified to do and what can you do based in the model that you're working with. So with the whole adverse effect discussion, it kind of goes the other way with language because there's a lot of times where kids technically don't qualify based on standard scores, or it's not necessarily clear how they qualify when it comes to things with writing, but you can see based on their language and based on what you know of them that they're not translating those skills that you've taught them into written discourse. and maybe their sentences are really choppy, maybe they have run-on sentences, or maybe they use really simple sentences one at a time, and they don't have complex sentences, so they're not necessarily applying that to paragraph level writing. And then sometimes the fact that they have those simple sentences, it can kind of take away, because they're focusing so much on sentence structure, that it takes away from the overall message and the process of writing. So, and that whole writing process gets into executive functioning skills as well, because you have to apply those language skills within this strategic process. And if kids don't have those executive functioning skills, then it gets a little bit harder. So, I mean, as a speech pathologist, you're absolutely qualified to do those things. Where it gets a little bit confusing is that sometimes it's almost expected that that is handed off to somebody else and not you when kids get to the upper elementary, junior high, high school level. And so sometimes we start moving them towards that model. I don't love it. I think that it would be beneficial for students to continue to get that support from speech pathologists as long as possible. So I always recommend to people that you continue to work on those things. So like, let's say that you've spent a decent amount of time using, like, teaching them complex sentences, and they could do it at the sentence level, and they do it conversationally. They don't have grammatical errors in conversation. Well, it's not as challenging as writing, so you're not going to see those errors as much. So it does make sense for a lot of students, if they've had a history of language disorders, to then transition to working on some of those more executive functioning skills. The reason I often emphasize these foundational skills, and why I emphasize that so much in LTA foundations, is because a lot of times teachers, even in like second, third grade, they're already focusing on those high level executive functioning skills, like the planning of your paragraph. And nobody is working on these foundational skills at all. So it makes sense the teacher's working on like the organization and the writing process, and nobody's working on these foundational skills, and the kid doesn't have it. That's where you come in. That's where you're kind of like this missing puzzle piece. But that doesn't mean that kids will never need that and that your role never needs to shift. It's just, I emphasize that so much because it is such a common missing area that everybody kind of like forgets about, or it's not necessarily that they're forgetting about it. It's just that there's so many things that they don't know where to focus. So that's why I harp so much on that. It's not because I don't think that other stuff is important. So with these particular students, especially the students that Rachel mentioned, I think that if you have noticed that they're pretty solid with these skills, with all these LTA foundations types of things, it does make sense for you to start to work on the writing process with them, if you can, as much as possible. I know that gets a little bit logistically confusing because it takes a long time to write an essay. So you might have to do kind of mini writing assignments, or you might have to like pick up on a writing assignment that they might be working on with teaching. And that's where you can go in and you can look at some of that. Like you can talk them through the planning process. You can practice having them take a bunch of ideas and write a paragraph about it. You can look at a paragraph they've already written and looked at their sentences and figure out how you can make their sentences more complex and more sophisticated. So you can kind of take that information that you've used, where you've talked about synonyms and describing words. And so you can take that and think, okay, look, if they're using the same words over and over again, you can think, say to them, like, what's another word that we could use right here in this sentence? Or if you notice that they're using the same sentence structure over and over again, or they have a lot of run-on sentences, you can kind of go back to the concept of that complex sentence and almost take their writing that they've done and see if you can almost do a sentence combining type activity or apply that concept within something else that they're doing. So you're using that concept to monitor and correct their own writing. So you're taking them to that application level. Now, you as the SLP might not necessarily be able to do all of this. So again, it might be where you're jumping in some of the time, you're sharing this information with teachers so that they can kind of take over. The bottom line is that they need that support from someone. It doesn't have to come from you. It could come from you. That would be great if it could, but if it can't, based on the amount of time you have with them, then you can do it in more of a consultation fashion. But that's how it should look. So I guess to answer your question, should we work in writing and oral? We should be mixing and matching and incorporating them both together. And is there a place where we do want to switch to more of that high level work with students? Yes, absolutely. And then the other question was about data collection. And I'm looking back at my conversation with Rachel. Okay, so what I did share, because this does get a little bit confusing. So where I always recommend that you start with writing is look at what the teachers are doing and look at how they're measuring their grades. Like what they might have a rubric for however they're assessing their students' performance. That's always like, I mean, that's how they're graded. I would start with that. But if you wanted some additional things to be able to track data in your sessions, unfortunately, there isn't a great formal test available for this. And I know that that's what you want. But sometimes kind of understanding what you're doing can be helpful in just taking data. But yeah, start with the rubric. The other thing that I've used, if you want a formal assessment, is the TOWEL 4. I've used that before. It's not really marketed as an SLP test. I actually borrowed it from the school psychologist that I worked with. It is a bit time consuming. Part of that was because it was I didn't administer it that much, so I couldn't just, bring it out and start going with it. I had to sit there and score it. That would be something that you could use more for an evaluation, not necessarily for progress monitoring. There are some additional CBMs. I'm going to post some links to information on CBMs for the elementary level. Again, CBMs are going to give you a number that you can use to track progress, but it's not going to give you a lot of descriptive information. So the same thing with like the TOWEL 4 and that assessment there. It's going to give you a score. It's not going to give you a ton of descriptive information, so you're still going to need to look at those rubrics that the teachers are using. And then also you're going to need to just look at the quality of the writing sample and figure out what your goal is for the students. And you're going to almost have to have some kind of a non-standardized measure that you're using. I have done writing CBMs before, but at the elementary level, actually what was done more often is the special ed teacher often did it with her students. And so she would often be the one doing it because she just had more time to administer it, but I would look at it and see how my students were doing. Again, it's kind of like with the literacy CBMs, one of the things is like they look at the number of letters that a kid can name or the letter sounds that a kid can name. It's a good thing to kind of give an objective, the student is improving in their letter sound fluency, for example. It's also something that is good for red flagging a student that might need intervention. But as far as giving you goals to work on, you are going to need some more descriptive information. It's kind of like with the CEL 5, for example, it gives you a score, but you still need to look deeper into that score. You can't just literally use the subtest to write a goal. So, I know that that's not necessarily the easiest answer, but you're probably going to need to do a combination of both of those things. So I'll share the information about the writing CBMs. That could be something that's useful for you to look into, or useful for you to look into and kind of collaborate with the teacher to figure out if you can divide and conquer and get enough information so that between the general education teacher, you have all of that information. I would say for your therapy, some of the things that you might want to be looking at are, you might look at their writing sample and look at grammatical errors. You could look at the number of complex sentences that they're writing. You could even just make an inventory of, like, when you look at their writing sample, you could look at the number of times that they used specific linguistic structures that you want them to use, like conjunctions, prepositions, different sentence types. And I'm just throwing out a lot of things right now, but you want to just kind of look at it and descriptively note what you see. It's not going to give you a number, but it is going to give you just kind of a descriptive list of what you're seeing from your students. So with writing, it is kind of hard, but it is very important. So in complex sentences, just to kind of give you something to keep an eye on, things like complex sentences and those diverse sentence structures are going to be things that you're going to want to see. So if you have a student who is using only basic simple sentence structures, and then they can transition to using a handful of more complex sentences, that could be a good thing for you to note within a writing sample. So whether that be a writing sample that you took during your session, or whether you just look at a writing sample they've done in the classroom. So those could be things that you could look at. I would be looking at that kind of thing. That might be something that you don't necessarily have to do every single time you're in a session with a student, but it could be something you do like every 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. And then in between that time, you might be looking at other qualitative things as far as data goes. So again, I'll share those writing CBM links for you to get a little bit more information. And then let me go to the last question. So the last question was about social skills. The question is, so for people who are in the social language roadmap course, which it addresses mostly for a framework for autistic students, but really any students that need some work with the social problem solving types of things. So I'm going to just list out the 2 case studies that we have here. So there's a ninth grade student who's in a small subject area classes, struggling significantly academically and socially. She's tried language therapy advanced, semantic feature analysis, and definition syntax, but he needs prompting and review, and it takes away from other high functioning group members. And that she's also focused on things like social problem solving, perspective taking, and reading the room. What kind of goals would you create for this student, and any advice on which direction to go in therapy? So for this particular student, this sounds like a student who needs both the academic work and the work socially. I'm not sure logistically what you have the bandwidth to do with the student, but it could be beneficial for him to have one group that's focused on the language skills, and then one group that's focused on the social skills. I would recommend looking at the social language roadmap course, because I'm not sure what specifically the student needs as far as the areas where he is not necessarily, or where he's struggling socially. I outlined in that course the 6 areas of social impairment. Again, remember that these 6 areas of social impairment, when that framework was made, it does reference, you want to consider neurotypical versus neurodiverse. So you want to keep that in mind, but also just tie it back to what is important for this student. So, if you're worried about, you don't want to be ableist and things like that, just make sure that you're making decisions based on something that is going to be a useful skill for this person's success, not something that is like, we're doing this because this is the normal way to do it, or this is the way we've always done it. Just always tie it back to what's going to be important to this student. Um, so I guess I would need a little bit more information about how he is struggling socially. And so what you'd want to do is tie it back to whatever skills that you're working on, tie it back to what specific area he's struggling the most. So that would be my direction for that as far as how to target and write goals is prioritize, like pick the top area where he's struggling socially and then have a group designed to address that. And then with the social skills specifically, this is going to be something that's important to do in a highly contextualized way. So it could be beneficial for you to have a discussion group where you're talking through some of those things with the students, but then you also want to make sure that there's somebody with him in those environments where he's struggling to kind of help him apply those skills. And he needs some kind of a method to get to cue him in those particular situations where he is struggling. So you want to just specify, aside from just broad social problem solving, what specific skills is he struggling to use while he's problem solving? What specific things are hard for him to read? Is it body language? Is it, like intonation? Is it, is he not sure how to initiate interactions or have a conversation with someone? Kind of figure out what skill is going to help move him forward. I would go back to what skill is going to help him, rather than these are norms and these are the way we're supposed to do it. Because if you're comparing it, if he's not neurotypical and you're comparing him to neurotypical norms, it's not going to be that useful. You want to consider neurotypical standards just to the extent of figuring out like how to navigate the situation. You don't necessarily want to do it in a way that's like, you have to do it this way because this is what everybody else is doing. So hopefully that makes sense. Figure out what's going to be the skill that's going to move the needle most for him. For the academic stuff, he might need a slower pace. I don't know, I'm not sure what your situation is, but I don't know if there's a way that you can take him with a different group that's a slower pace. Yeah, I'd be curious if there's some more information you could share there about some different possibilities that you could look into for this student if he's not fitting the pace of this particular group. Because there might be one specific area where he's struggling more, and the other kids might need to just kind of move along and cycle through the process, and he might need to really dive into one specific area. So I'm curious if there's some flexibility there. Okay, those are my thoughts there, but feel free to follow up with any additional information and we can go back and forth on this. So the other student is a student who is diagnosed with depression and hospitalized for it and autism. Teacher reports he will talk to peers when teachers are not around or nearby to witness. He has friends. He's on the high school track team. The coach will speak to his friends on the team and have them communicate things for him. The student does not respond to the coach directly. So basically the student doesn't talk to the adults, but will talk to peers, will have friends. He's bright. He shows understanding. It's kind of the opposite. A lot of times, sometimes kids will be the opposite where they know how to interact with adults, but they're not necessarily sure how to interact with their own peers. So it's great that he's interacting with his peers. It's great that that he's bright and he's showing understanding. This is another one where I would recommend working with somebody who has like a social worker or a psychologist that has a background in depression and some of the mental health things that are going on here, because I don't know that this is a language issue. The fact that he has autism, yes, obviously that's kind of a red flag that you want to look into this. But if he's functioning, if he's participating in class in some way, and if he is showing understanding of the material and progressing along, and socially he has friends. So that's a good sign. Where it gets a little bit challenging is that if this student doesn't talk to adults and interact with them at all, that could be a problem for him from a functional standpoint. It sounds like he's working around it for now, but it would definitely open up a lot of possibilities for him if he would be able to work through whatever is going on with his situation, with however he's not, like, why ever he's not interacting with adults. And so I really think for that particular situation, this could be classified in the selective mutism area, but this really definitely needs some assistance from somebody who has a background in working through some of those things, because there could be ways that maybe you could move him towards interacting with adults, whether it be different mode besides verbal. But I do think it would definitely be beneficial to move him as close to that as possible. So you could probably be involved in that process as far as thinking of creative ways for him to communicate, and thinking of creative ways for you to kind of inch him towards where you want him to go. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're not gonna, if you try to force him and to put him in a situation that's super traumatic for him, like, we don't know why he is doing what he's doing. There could be some trauma there, and it is really important to move people beyond their comfort zone. But that whole process, like, if you do it too fast, that can be very traumatizing. And so you want to do that very carefully and very mindfully, because we don't want to do too much too soon and push him back to re-trigger some trauma. There definitely needs to be, like, if you're dealing with that kind of thing, you definitely need somebody who's qualified to do that. And so, as speech pathologists, obviously we work with people who have experienced those types of things, and we need to be aware of it, but it's not in our scope necessarily to work through, like, we're not the ones that are trained to deal with that specific trauma. So we could be involved in the communication aspect, but we need to be working closely with somebody else. So I'd be curious what other professionals are involved here, and how you can work together to figure out how we can get an idea of where he is functioning socially, and how we can get him to move towards being able to interact with adults more. Because it is going to be really hard, like, if you have a student who won't talk to you in therapy, that it's going to be hard for them to participate. So I don't know if you've identified some specific things that he could be working on, if there's a way that he could participate in therapy in some way without talking to you, and you kind of just, again, inch towards it. I don't know if he would be comfortable just using like an alternative communication system with you. That would be a way that you might be able to work with the student in some way. Like, if he's just communicating in written form, that would be a way that you could communicate with the student. So I would be looking for ways to expand his comfort zone, but at the same time, also be open to those alternative ways. Because if the student can communicate through written form and through all these other forms, that's going to be a good, like, we need to figure out a way to help the student learn right now with the status that, where it currently is. Because, while we work through some of those all the trauma and those other things. So yeah, I would be thinking about those types of things. How can I get as much information and interaction with the student as possible within what the current status is, And then how can I work with the other professionals to figure out how much we push him beyond this comfort zone and try to expand what he's able to do. So, yeah, we're right at about an hour. Let me just double check my thing here. Okay, so I know that there were a lot of really good questions, and I gave some answers, but there's a lot of things that I gave today where you're going to probably have to, process it, think about it, go and get some more information or share some information with me, and then we'll go back and forth. So again, leave me your comments below, start a new thread in the group if you have some updates on these situations. And again, thank you so much for all your questions. We'll wrap up.